What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the history of disc golf. It is a freezing cold Florida morning, which means it's about 65 degrees outside. And I figured we'd tackle this fascinating subject. Fascinating mostly because nobody really knows much about the beginnings of disc golf. Either way, it's an interesting study. It tells us where we all came from and how we got to this point. So if you're interested, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button and stay tuned for more. The history of disc golf is as ambiguous as Jack the Ripper, although not nearly as violent, thankfully, mostly because people have played some variation off and on over a century since the Frisbee was invented in the 1930s. They certainly didn't abide by the same rules that we do today. Still, it's not hard to imagine a family gathering, maybe a cookout or something similar, and playing a game of land the Frisbee in whatever contraption you can think of. What we know for certain about the sport is that Ed Hedrick established the Disc Golf Association in 1976. He intended to promote the sport and spread the momentum for constructing disc golf courses nationwide. It's hard to argue with his contribution because there are now over 10,000 courses in America. Hedrick didn't just start an association, he also coined the term disc golf. He wanted to name it Frisbee Pole Hole, but thankfully that didn't work out, or disc golf would probably be the butt of every coitus joke originating in the last 50 years or so. The term was a trademark issue for whatever reason, thanks to Whammo, a Frisbee company also largely regarded in disc golf lore. It's doubtful that Ed Hedrick just fell out of bed one day and thought of the sport and all of its rules, regulations, and formalities. As I said in the beginning, people were already playing some variation of disc golf well before Ed came along and put a name on it. Whether they were throwing Frisbees at garbage cans, boxes, milk crates, or some other holding container is irrelevant to the point that Ed evolved the sport rather than created it. Disc golf in those days was a freestyle thing, popular as badminton and almost entirely a backyard activity that never stretched beyond the borders of the average yard in a suburban neighborhood, at least not for the most part. There were a few quote-unquote courses out there that people actually used to sling Frisbees at various containers, but not too many. Though Ed established the term disc golf in 1976, the idea for the first course was cultivated 2 years prior, in 1974. In fact, thanks to Ed Hedrick, the sport was already in motion, having been played a few times in the years between the first course idea and the creation of then disc golf trademark, a trademark Ed would later release to continue facilitating growth in the sport. The home of the first disc golf course in the world, at least officially, is Oak Grove Park, and it owes its existence to Ed and the Los Angeles Park and Recreation Department, thanks to a willing park director. Though it's no longer known as Oak Grove, which sounds like a local town's generic name for a disc golf in 2024, it's still in Pasadena, California, in case you're ever in the neighborhood. The first disc golf discs, not including the Frisbees that came before them, were about as bare minimum as you can imagine. They were more like a cross between a putter and a traditional Frisbee. Hedrick may have had a creative mind for facilitating and growing the sport, but the first discs were aptly and quite boringly named disc golf discs. They came in various colors, and the designs were different enough to formulate the concepts of driver, mid-range, and putter even back then. Ed designed these, and if you want to check them out, it's U.S. patent 3,359,678, issued in 1966. Since he didn't end up working with the Los Angeles Park and Recreation Department for nearly a decade in the future, the 1966 patent is proof that he had at least the outlines of the disc golf sport idea in his mind at the time. Speaking of the time, Ed worked for Whammo in the 1960s as vice president of the company. Next would come the catching device, known at the time as the disc pole hole. It's almost as if the mindset of the 70s was as generic and lame as it gets. But, lame or not, the pole hole consisted of a 10-chain catching system, and the chains hung suspended over a basket, just like today's more ergonomically and aesthetically appealing baskets. If you want a better look at these, Google U.S. patent 4,039,189, issued in 1975. The design drawings may be fairly rudimentary, but it's immediately recognizable as a disc golf basket. I don't think anyone would accidentally mistake it for a mailbox. Before moving forward, we should back up just a bit and properly recognize another name from the history of disc golf lore, George Sappenfield. While George played a regular old game of golf in 1965, he had the bright idea of his kids and other kids playing the same sport, but with Frisbees instead. It made sense. I don't think anyone can argue that the effort of getting into disc golf is much more attractive than getting into golf, partly because it's easier and cheaper. One can argue that disc golf is just as technical and complicated as golf, but there is no arguing the attractiveness features of simplicity and affordability for newbies. George wasn't the only one with the idea. Kevin Donnelly, a recreation instructor at Fresno State University, was also busy promoting the idea of Frisbee golf, as they conveniently called it back then. George would hold a position with Wham-O as a promotions consultant. He would later meet up with Ed Hedrick and work towards creating and holding a disc golf event, the success of which led George to a productive career as a full-time employee with Wham-O. Here's where things get interesting. A guy named Goldie Norton wrote the first official book on the sport. Ed Hedrick and George Sappenfield were manufacturing the sport from the ground up, and in the meantime, Jim Palmieri played disc golf tournaments in New York in the 1970s. Jim was not associated with any of the above, nor did he know about them, nor were George and Ed close friends or associates with Goldie. Yet from opposite sides of the country, the sport was growing independently. It's about as homegrown a sport as one can get from all sides of the country. Wham-O would go on to sponsor a World Frisbee Championship, a definite precursor to the tournaments we watch on ESPN today. In the meantime, Ed was acting like a traveling salesman, except he wasn't selling anything, at least not in terms of disc golf. He was promoting the sport. Ed did a lot for the sport and is probably one of the biggest factors in the game's success today. Without him, who knows? Maybe disc golf would be where it is today, and maybe not. He created the DGA, would later create the International Frisbee Association, and would ultimately combine elements of both and create the PDGA that we all know of now. By the time the PDGA rolled around, there were already ranked players nationwide. Ed didn't leave them hanging, reaching out to each and every one of them and encouraging them to join his newfound PDGA. It's essentially a nationalized sport, which would later become more than just a singular continent enterprise. But at the time, it was a huge step, and national tournaments were going on long before ESPN picked up on the action. While disc golf isn't up there with golf yet in terms of fan base and money, it continues to grow extremely rapidly, mostly because just about anyone can pick up the sport and play relatively cheap. Later, Ed would do himself a lot of disfavors, but these actions, mostly spiteful attempts at maintaining absolute control over the organization he had a huge hand in crafting, didn't reduce the visibility or viability of the sport. At this point, the ball was already rolling down the hill, and no one was going to stand on the hill and try to field it before it reached its full speed and potential. A new disc golf manufacturer, Champion Disc, formed in 1983, later becoming known as Innova Disc, but keeping the Champion moniker for one of its more popular plastic lines. The first Champion Disc manufacturer was the Eagle, which quickly took over the driver category and catapulted Innova into the stratosphere. Dave Dunapace is the name most associated with Innova, as the founder of Innova Disc Golf and largely responsible for the shape and style of the disc that became the Eagle and all the other discs that would follow, continually tweaking the designs to create a monstrous market full of high-speed drivers, fairway drivers, mid-range discs, putters, and various hybrids that play multiple roles in a disc golf player's bag. Multiple plastic and beaded variations would soon follow, based mostly on the needs and demands of the players and those who held a stake in the leadership of the PDGA. DGA and Discraft are well-known manufacturers in the burgeoning disc golf community, and they were created in 1976 and 1978, respectively. Aerobie came along in 1984 and was pretty popular before taking a back seat and eventually fading away. Today, more disc golf brands are out there than there are worth counting. Some of the more notable ones include Innova, Discraft, Infinite Discs, Axiom, Gateway, Millennium, Viking, Castoplast, and the Trilogy brands, otherwise known as Latitude 64, Westside Discs, and Dynamic Discs. There are many more than that, and I don't mean to leave anyone hanging, but time is always an issue, and I'm not here to cite lists until you fall asleep. Outside of the discs, the first Mach 1 basket, thankfully not called a pole in the hole, came along not long after the formation of the DGA. The Mach 1 is the patent listed above. Remember, it only had 10 chains, but it did well enough for disc golf players back in the day. Of course, it didn't take long for new concepts and improved baskets like the Mach 2 and the Mach 3. Now every major disc manufacturer seems to have their own line of PDGA-approved baskets. You're as likely to see a Prodigy basket on the course as one of the Mach variations. There are also portable, temporary, and permanent baskets for anyone to purchase and use on their own time or permanently install on their property. You can build your own disc golf course if you have the land. In the 1980s, disc golf course development exploded, a direct result of formalization of the sport in the previous decade. Courses were springing up everywhere, and it's only sped up since then. In fact, the following decade, the sport would explode worldwide, becoming a global phenomenon rather than just a U.S. sport. Though the DGA and International formalized the sport in the 1970s, the PDGA took everything to the next level in the 1980s, making the sport a worldwide hobby and a professional option for the best of the best. So it took a lot more than just Ed Hedrick to really get the sport going, and I find it interesting that it actually took quite a few people from all over the country, in a lot of cases they didn't even know what the other was doing, to really get the sport going. And also find it interesting that Ed Hedrick kind of turned out to be an antagonist, a villain, so to speak, again with the PDGA. And of course, everybody kind of wanting to get in on the excitement, so to speak, and push him out. And not necessarily push him out, that's just the way the guy felt. But either way, 10-minute or so video, there's no way I'm going to be able to cram every aspect of disc golf history in here. So feel free to add your own comments and input at things you may have learned. Also, hit that like and subscribe button on your way out. And thanks for watching. We'll see you on the course.